Hello everybody, today we'll be talking about Chapter 33, The Great War, A World in Upheaval, with a particular focus on Europe during the years 1914 to 1918. In order to understand World War I, you must first understand the political climate of Europe prior to World War I. The European continent was comprised of many competing powers during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Beginning in the mid to late 1800s, European nations began enveloping themselves in military alliances, not realizing the future implication that these agreements would have. The two most important and powerful alliances were the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. The Triple Entente consisted of Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire, while the Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These two alliances will play a major role in the coming years, especially regarding World War I. Nationalism is defined as loyalty and devotion to a nation. 18th and 19th century global independence movements, as well as the long-awaited unification of nations such as Italy and Germany, led to an increased sense of nationalism across Europe. The close proximity of many of these nations led to rivalries, with each nation desiring to be stronger economically, industrially, and militarily than their neighbors. European nations also competed over colonies in Africa, creating territorial conflicts. The combination of military alliances and the newfound European nationalism created a very volatile political environment in Europe. Tensions between nations were also high, especially France and Germany. They had been opponents in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, leading to bad blood between these two European powers. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and was targeted by these nationalists due to his high status as a member of the Habsburg royal family. Princip was associated with a group called the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group that sought independence from the Austro-Hungarians. Austria-Hungary had been in control of Serbia since 1878, and nationalist groups such as the Black Hand sought independence. Princip was captured and tried for his actions, eventually dying in prison. The outbreak of war. Following the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary issued Serbia an ultimatum. The Serbian response was seen as unsatisfactory, and Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. This declaration of war caused Russia to begin to mobilize their troops. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia on August 1st, and then declaring war on France 2 days later, on August 3rd. Germany then invaded Belgium, trying to surprise and outflank the French. This maneuver was called the Schlieffen Plan. 1 day later, on August 4th, Great Britain also declared war on Germany. By August 12th, all major countries in the Triple Entente were engaged in war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So as you can see, those alliances bit those countries later down the line as they had to all fight each other. Even though Germany and Great Britain didn't really have any fight, they still had to declare war to the military alliances. Here's a little flowchart that shows it better. It shows Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated June 28, 1914. Germany grants Austria-Hungary a blank check to punish Serbia, July 6, 1914. Punitive ultimatum to Serbia by Austria-Hungary, July 23rd. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, July 28th. Russia mobilizes, July 31st. Germany and France mobilized, August 1st. German ultimatum to Belgium. British ultimatum to Germany, August 2nd and 3rd. Germany's invasion of Belgium and expiration of British ultimatum. The war began on August 4th. Warfare begins on the Western Front. Following Germany's invasion of Belgium, fighting began in earnest in the late summer of 1914. Countries allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary became known as the Central Powers. Countries allied with France, Great Britain, and Russia became known as the Allied Powers. The early months of the war saw hasty mobilization of both sides, with the fall of 1914 being one of the only times that mobile warfare was heavily used on the Western Front. Several battles were fought during this time, with the Allied and Central forces attempting to outmaneuver and outflank each other. By late October 1914, trench warfare began to dominate the Western Front. Though not known at the time, trench warfare would become the primary form of fighting on the Western Front, essentially creating a lethal 4-year stalemate. Warfare on the Western Front. French forces originally hoped that their rapid offenses would help them win a swift victory over the Germans, but they soon learned that this was not the case. Likewise, Germany desired to defeat France quickly and then switch its focus to the east, where the threat of the Russian Empire loomed. French and British forces had well-established positions across Western Europe by 1914, preventing the Central Powers from breaking through their lines. Germany made several attempted advances between 1914 and 1915, yet they were repelled by the Allied forces each time. Several major battles were fought over this time, some lasting several months or years. The United States' involvement that started in 1917 brought great support to the Allied powers, which assisted them in repelling the German forces, leading to the Allies having the upper hand on the Western Front. Major battles of the Western Front. September 6th through 12th, 1914, the First Battle of the Marne. This battle successfully halted the German advance into France, which initiated trench warfare on the Western Front. February 21st to December 18th, 1916, the Battle of Verdun. German forces attempted to attack the French town of Verdun and inflict large casualties to Allied troops. The Germans were defeated after taking heavy losses. July 1st to November 18th, 1916, Battle of the Somme. An attempted Allied advance that provoked very little success. British troops gained a slight amount of land, but this battle did not have any strategic advantage to the Allies. Casualties were more than 1 million. July 31st to November 6, 1917, Third Battle of Ypres. Intended to be a decisive Allied advance, poor weather conditions and a strong German defense led to a costly defeat. July 15th to August 5th, Second Battle of the Marne. German forces attempted an assault to regain French territory, but a swift Allied counterattack decimated the forces, inflicting heavy casualties and a defeat to Germany. Here's a photo of British forces in the trenches at the Battle of the Somme. As you can see, the conditions are less than ideal. Many soldiers in these trenches got diseases such as trench foot, where the foot became waterlogged and diseased. And now only imagine having to spend several months to a year in these kind of conditions where it's muddy and dirty in these trenches. Warfare begins on the Eastern Front. Warfare on the Eastern Front was fought in a much different way than the stalemate on the Western Front. The Russian Empire in 1914 had a large, yet ill-equipped military. Warfare began in August 1914 with a large Russian offensive towards eastern Prussia, territory that was controlled by Germany. Fighting on this front was much more mobile, with large-scale offensives and the advancement of troops. Between 1914 and 1916, both the Central Powers and the Russian Empire saw some success in their attacks, with land often being captured and then recaptured by both armies. Warfare on the Eastern Front continued. In 1917, Russian General Alexei Brusilov launched a large summer offensive into Austro-Hungarian territory. This offensive was known as the Brusilov Offensive and was the Russian Empire's most successful maneuver of the war. Though the Brusilov offensive yielded large gains, the Russian Empire suffered extremely large casualties. Despite this successful offensive, a civil war broke out between Tsarist forces and the Communist revolutionaries in 1917. This effectively ended Russia's involvement in the war, allowing many Central Power forces to be transferred to the Western Front. Major battles of the Eastern Front. August 1914, Battle of Tannenberg. German forces, attempting to slow Russian advances into East Prussia, met with the Russian army. This battle resulted in German victory and was essential to the defense of East Prussia. January 1915, the Battle of Bolimov. This battle saw widespread use of deadly gas weapons, and neither the forces of Russia or Germany gained any advantage from it. June 1916, the Battle of Lusk. This was the first major battle of the Brusilov offensive. The forces of Russia and Austria-Hungary met, resulting in the decisive defeat of Austro-Hungarian forces. Here's a photo of German forces preparing for a Russian offensive in eastern Poland, 1915. A lot of times these territories would be captured and recaptured over and over, as the warfare on the Eastern Front was much more mobile than the warfare seen on the Western Front. War on the home front. The scale and demand of the war guaranteed that the whole country would have to contribute to the war effort. The introduction to mass media ensured that those on the home front would be informed and up-to-date during the war. These new mass medias were also being used to spread propaganda across the civilian population. Women were a group that were particularly affected, as many of them had to take up jobs in factories and industries while the men were fighting. This only further strengthened the calls for women's suffrage in the war years, and countries such as Great Britain and the United States granted women the right to vote in 1918 and 1920 respectively. The demand for industry served to bolster the industrial strength of many nations, particularly Germany and Great Britain. The tech of the war. Many consider World War I to be the first modern war, as it introduced many machines and tactics that are still used today. Automatic weapons were used on both fronts, and this was the first time these weapons had seen widespread use. Tanks were introduced by the British during the Battle of the Somme. By the end of the war, both the Allied and the Central Powers were using tanks. World War I also saw the first use of airplanes in combat. As these planes were quite rudimentary, they were primarily used for surveying and bombing. Many dogfights also occurred between opposing aerial forces, leading to the first use of the term flying ace. Gas weapons were also used during the war, particularly by the Central Powers. These horrific gases killed thousands when they were first used on the battlefield. Here are some British soldiers atop a British Mark IV tank, the most popularly and widely produced tank during the war. As you can see, its all-terrain capabilities made it difficult for the German forces to stop. It could just go right over the top of a trench, didn't have to worry about small arms fire. It was heavily armored and defended well, and had 2 or 3 cannons on it. The war approached its end. The sinking of the Lusitania and other German aggressions towards the United States caused them to enter the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. This influx of fresh troops, along with multiple Allied offensives, eventually caused the German army to push back. By 1918, German forces were demoralized and diseased, especially after suffering heavy losses at the hands of the Allies. After the surrender of other smaller Central Powers, with Germany being the last country to surrender, signing an armistice on November 11, 1918. Aftermath of the war. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles brought the war to its official end on June 28, 1919, even though fighting had ceased in November 1918. In the treaty, Woodrow Wilson outlined his 14 points, calling for a democratic Europe as well as the formation of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created as a group of countries whose main objective was to solve international disputes with diplomacy and debate. The League of Nations was the precursor to the modern-day United Nations. Outcome for the Central Powers. The conditions created by the Treaty of Versailles placed great sanctions and stipulations upon the defeated Central Powers. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up and divided into a variety of separate countries, many of which are still around in the modern day. Germany took the largest amount of the blame, as the Allied countries saw Germany as the main aggressor during the war. Along with having their military restricted and having some of their territory annexed, they were forced to pay reparations to the Allied powers, causing them to sink into economic ruin in the years following the war. In the 1930s, these reparations and economic hard times contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler, who would eventually plunge Germany into World War II. Here's a photo of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, June 1919, in France. This officially ended the war, even though fighting had stopped months earlier. Conclusion. More than 15 million people died during World War I, making it one of the most devastating conflicts in the history of warfare. The international scale of the conflict led to many countries being affected, with many of them taking a long time to recover. Some countries, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, never recovered. They were destroyed and disbanded. The Ottomans, in the middle of the war, had Arab peoples revolt against them, causing them to withdraw from the war and eventually their empire to collapse. And the Austro-Hungarians were divided up by the Allied powers into 9 different countries. World War I majorly affected the start of World War II, with many historians claiming that without the First World War, the Second World War would have never occurred. The United States emerged as a true power for the first time in World War I, showing its might on Europe's Western Front during the war. It was also during this time that the Russian Revolution of 1916 led to the creation of another major power, the Soviet Union. The United States and the Soviet Union will play massive roles in the years to follow, especially during World War II. They would also be engaged in the Cold War after the years of World War II. So the United States and the Soviet Union, World War I really helped emerge these two countries as great superpowers. Thank you. This has been Chapter 33, A World in Upheaval.